In this video, we will continue with the topics introduced in the previous video. We will connect to our SQL Server instance using SSMS, and we will write some simple queries against some databases. There are two databases that will be used in your next assignment. We will introduce those now. And I want you to pause the video here, go to Course Documents on Blackboard, and grab the credentials for logging into the AP database. Those credentials are not presented here in the video for security reasons. Here's SSMS. I am already logged in using the login credentials for the AP database. AP stands for Accounts Payable. It's a simple accounting database that is publicly available, provided by Microsoft. If you open the database folder, you will see a whole raft of databases. When you are logged in with the AP credentials, you will only have access to the AP database. Notice at the top of the Object Explorer, it clearly shows that I'm logged in using the AP login. When you do your homework, it is very important that you show me in the screenshots that you are logged in correctly, so I know that it is you that is doing this work. When I open the AP database and open the tables folder, there are some tables there that we can work with to write SQL statements. You have permission to do a few things, but not a lot. If you right-click on a table, you can look at the contents of the table. You also get the added benefit of seeing the SQL statement that SSMS generated to do that work for you. At the bottom is the results generated by that SQL statement. At the top is SQL. And this is the kind of code that I will be asking you to write throughout this course. So if you get stuck, here's a quick and easy way to get a refresher sometimes to see exactly what should be happening, get some correct syntax, and maybe get you off the confusion that you're in. I'm going to close the SQL window and refer you back to the Object Explorer. There are tables here that we can work with to write some queries. And let's propose that we are given this question to answer. What are the vendor names in ascending alphabetical order? If we break this down the way we did on the previous slide, what columns or expressions are required for the results to be useful to our customer? Well, the customer only wants to know the vendor name. That's not complex. That's easy to do. Are there any expressions? Do they want to know how many vendors there are? Do they want to know how many start with the letter S? There are no expressions. What tables are we going to need? Well, your customer is not going to tell you what tables to use. You're going to have to decide that on your own. That's part of your job. So you need to know that the vendor names are in the vendors table. If you don't know that, you need to get the documentation for the database or talk to somebody else who's more familiar, or just go hunting. But that is a question that you will have to answer. Has your customer asked you to filter the data in any way? Does your customer only want vendors in Ohio? Do they only want vendors with open invoices? No, there are no filters in that question. How do they want the vendor names presented? Well, in this case, they were very clear. They want them in alphabetical order. In a lot of situations, you are presented with a question like this, and you have the obligation to ask for more information. If you are asked to provide vendor names, it is completely reasonable for you to ask, how do you want those presented? Do you want those in alphabetical order, ascending, descending? Do you want them listed by state? Do you want them grouped by some vendor rating? Those are perfectly reasonable questions to ask, so don't be shy about asking those kind of questions. The last point here at the bottom of the slide, do they want all the vendors, all the rows in the table, or do they want a subset? Well, in this case, they said, what are the vendor names? We can assume they want all the vendor names. Again, if you think there is a reasonable expectation of restricting the result set, if there are 10 million vendors, you might want to come back and say, Mr. Customer, there are 10 million vendors. Do you really want all 10 million? That is an obligation that you have to help get your customer to where they think they want to be. Here we go. We're in the AP database, and we wrote a SQL statement. You can see here it says select vendor name from vendors, order by vendor name ASC, which is ascending. Now, ascending is also the default, but we generally frown on defaults. We generally try to be as explicit as we can. So this is what you will be doing. This is your job this semester, is writing these queries. Let's flip back over to SSMS and let's do this work. We need to open a query window so we have some place to do our job. Click on the New Query button, and to be safe, we will always tell SSMS what database to use, because we could have accidentally selected a different database. As you can see, there are many of them there. So to be precise and to be completely clear of our intentions, we will say use AP. That tells SSMS that our query is against the AP database. And your job, we build the clauses, put the clauses together, and come up with a working SQL statement. Select. Now, I'm not sure, or let's act like we're not sure, because let's act like we haven't seen it. We're not sure what the column name is in the vendors table. And we got off easy this time because the question we were asked to answer is vendor names, and we've got a table called vendors. Probably a pretty safe bet vendor names are in the vendor table. Well, the column we're after is called vendor name. Select vendor name. That's all we need. We get a squiggle, but don't panic. SSMS is just trying to get ahead of us, and it will go away. The next clause is from. Where is the vendor name coming from? We already know that it's from the vendors table. Now, that by itself is probably enough. Let's try to run that. Click execute, and there is our results. Another hot tip for you, be sure that you're in the query window before you select execute, because you can't execute from the Object Explorer, you can't execute from the results window. Also, be very careful what you highlight. If you highlight something in a query window and click execute, it will execute only what you have highlighted. So watch this big mess. I get this error, incorrect syntax near select, even though I know that this query is perfectly well formed and should work. I only highlighted the select keyword. I clicked execute, and it tried to execute nothing but the select keyword. Save yourself a lot of frustration. Be very careful what you highlight. If we go back to our question again, vendor names in ascending alpha order. We have the vendor names, but we haven't specified the order. Order by vendor name ASC. That is the default. That's not going to change this result set, but we still need to do that because things behind the scenes might cause this to break later. Be explicit, be precise, put the order by clause in there. What I'd also like you to do to make this easier to read is to break this up by clause. And if you'd like to be very specific, the use statement is different from the select statement. We can put a blank line in there if we like. The select, the from, and the order by should be on separate lines to make it easier to read, because you will learn very quickly that these statements get complex, and the better you can break them up, the easier they are to read. If we run this again, in the results set, notice the column heading, vendor name with no spaces. You can see that vendor name came from the name that we had in the table. Okay, the table column name or attribute name is vendor name with no spaces. Now that's perfectly fine in a table name. It should be that way. There shouldn't be any spaces in there. But in the results set, it's a little bit ugly. It would be nice to make this a little more user-friendly and put some spaces in here to break up this vendor name. So what we can do is use an as clause and tell SQL Server that we want the column heading to be overridden, and instead of vendor name with no spaces, we want vendor space name. Let's try that. Now, if you look at the results set, it's much more friendly. And this becomes very important as queries get more complex. I want you to follow this standard. I want you to use the as clause to rename your columns under all circumstances. Always rename the columns to be more user-friendly. In the next video, we will write more complex select queries.